before starting this webinar, first I would like to request Principal Sir to inaugurate this session by expressing few words about Indian literature and Indian culture and whatever he thinks. So, Principal Sir, over to you. And it was very grateful. First of all, I would like to say thank you that you are here and you are busy with so many works. Even then, you took time for us. So, without much ado, I request you to come and say a few words about this webinar.
Thank you.
Sir. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Akhilesh. Let me, let me first, express my gratitude to Madam Rohini Chowdhury ji for accepting the invitation to talk on a very important area in literature, especially the Indian literature, and I think it's partial mythology and partial literature, and it is going to be quite interesting because we know there are many issues which are discussed from time to time as far as Shri Ramcharitamanas is concerned, and also the Katha Sagar, which we normally in Sikhism interpret it slightly differently in Punjabi literature. I'm sure this will evoke a lot of interest in the critical analysis of literature, because Indian subcontinent has produced many important monologues and the literature which needs to be brought and needs to be discussed and analyzed in a very, very perspective framework. I remember, during the 50s when we were students, I remember in 1969 when I was just 11 years old and the 500th birth anniversary of Guru Nanak was being celebrated. Prior to that, it was almost a ban on the discussion of Guru Granth Sahib, because people thought that the academics may say something which may not be, appreciated, which may be critical of the established norms. So this may not be accepted. That was the position prior to 1969. But after that, the Guru Nanak Dev University was set up, and there is a critical, analytical analysis of Guru Granth Sahib from different perspectives. It is not only a spiritual text; it is, discussed in various forms, and when it became the subject of this discussion in academic circles, I remember, 16 best volumes were produced on Guru Nanak Dev Ji separately. And then Guru Granth Sahib also, the central government has sanctioned a huge project to Guru Nanak Dev University, which, and they established Guru Granth Sahib Center for Sikh Studies, where, a lot of interfaith studies are being conducted. Similarly, when we discuss Ramcharitamanas, I think people may have different interpretations, but these are very useful. These are very important to understand how the people understand, how the people perceive it is related to their own cultural values. I am grateful to all my colleagues, Dr. Akhilesh, Dr. Shaikat, Ritvik ji, and even my colleague, other colleagues in the department for organizing this talk. And I'm sure, this will espouse a lot of interest in the area, and we will all benefit very significantly. Thank you once again. I welcome Madam Rohini Chowdhury for this talk. And thank you, Akhilesh ji, for giving me this chance to, share my brief on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir, for this wonderful inauguration. And obviously, I would like to have mentioned that Tulsidas and Guru Nanak Dev Ji, they were almost contemporary. So it would be more interesting if we will read the work of Tulsidas and Upadesh of Guru Nanak Ji simultaneously. And I hope in future we would be able to do some good work over all these things. So, sir, I'm really grateful to you. And once again, thank you so much.
Akhilesh, I forgot to mention Professor Jiva Verma, who is our mentor. In fact, is a very senior professor, and we have grown before his eyes. Not only the Khalsa College, I think entire literary studies in University of Delhi. Professor Jiva Verma is very closely associated with all of us, and his ambit is not restricted to English literature. He has been guiding us in various fora, in various forms, and and we have benefited significantly from his experience. And I remember his very polite words, and how he used to guide us in different meetings also. Thank you very much for that, Professor.
Yes, sir. And sir also taught me in MA. Rajiva Verma, sir, he taught. Hello, sir. Good afternoon, sir.
Hello. I can't see you, Akhilesh, but thank you nevertheless.
Yes,
हाँ जी, 3:30 पे है सर. हाँ जी,
Yes,
सर 3:30 पे है. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Thank you, Professor Jiva Verma, for that.
Well, thank you, Professor Jaswinder Singh. It was lovely seeing you after such a long time.
Right.
And I'd like to thank the college and the organizers for throwing this event open to everybody. I saw this on my, in the messages, and the subject seems to be very intriguing and very interesting. Putting together two very different works like the Ramcharit Manas in Awadhi and the Katha Sarit Sagar, an older work in Sanskrit, and a very intriguing subject. And I happen to be working on some aspects of the Katha Sarit Sagar in connection with my Shakespearean interests. So I'm very interested, and I was both intrigued and interested. And so thank you for giving me this opportunity to be here. And it was lovely meeting you. Lovely meeting you, though over the internet. Jaswinder Singh, lovely meeting you. Thanks a lot.
No, sir. Thank you, sir. And it is good that we know that, and we can see, or we can do some comparative study. And it is good that you provided this information. We did not know that you had tried to show sort of connectivity between Shakespeare and Shakespeare's play and Katha Sarit Sagar. So, sir, once again, I'm really thankful to you, and it is good that once again I'm meeting my teacher. Although I'm meeting to my teacher in virtual mode, but yeah, it is very grateful that you came here, and I hope, and you will be there. We will have more discussion and healthy discussion.
Thank you very much indeed.
So now, first, I would like to introduce Rohini Chowdhury ji, and she's pioneer in the field of translation studies, and she has also written plenty of book on children's literature or many short stories related to children. And her translation, her interest in translation, or whether to what extent she is interested, few examples are enough to prove her area of interest in translation. For instance, she has translated Ardha Kathanak by Banarsi Das. Apart from that, she has translated Tyag Path by Janendra entitled Resignation. And apart from that, she has also translated some works from Sanskrit like Panchatantra, Katha Sarit Sagar, and she has translated Guljar also. So, and obviously, she is going to deliver the lecture on Ramcharit Manas, and which she has translated in 3 volumes. Here, I would like to mention that there are 11 translations of Ramcharit Manas is available. So last year, I knew that only 10th translation of Ramcharit Manas is available, but all of a sudden, I came to know that no, a person whose translation will be considered as the 10th translation is going to be considered as the 11th translation. And that time I came to know about Rohini Chowdhury ji, and that time I came to know that it is her 10th translation, and 11th, that person who was translating, that translated version would be 11th translation of Ramcharitmanas. So it seems after reading or a lot of information related to Rohini ji, it seems that she is very cosmopolitan, and uh, she is very, in a way, you can say that she's all rounder kind of person. And uh, it is good, and we will find in her translation that she's always trying to trying to portray the origin of Indian culture or cultural text in her translation. Many translators, they try and they interpret the translated version or their work in the context of Western interpretation. But whatever I have read, on that basis, I can say that she has not done this kind of things, and she has given the justice to uh, source language also. So without much ado, I would request Rohini Chaudhary ji to deliver her lecture. Thank you, madam.
Thank you, Dr. Akhilesh Kumar, for the very flattering introduction and for this opportunity to be here. And my thanks also to all the very distinguished faculty that is present here. And I feel quite overwhelmed to be in the presence of such learned people as Dr. Verma and Dr. Singh. I don't need to say very much about myself. Dr. Kumar has given a very detailed introduction. So maybe I will just start with the topic of our conversation today. The students here, is it possible for you to switch your cameras on so I can see who you are? If possible, that would be good. Because I don't want this to be a session where I'm just talking at you. I would like to have some degree of interactivity, see your faces, and so I can tell, are you bored out of your minds? Are you interested? So it will be very useful if you could switch your cameras on. I will be asking perhaps a few questions here and there, and I would be delighted if the students would participate and answer, because that would also help me a little bit to know where you are in terms of this text. And we are going to start the first session with the Ramcharitmanas. Now, as all of you here, I am sure know, I mean, of course, the distinguished faculty does, but at this point, I'm addressing myself to the students. As I'm sure all of you know, and as all of you have learned, the Ramcharitmanas is a vast, vast work. And it has so many aspects to it that it's really not possible for anyone to cover everything in the 40 minutes that we have today to do this. So I am going to start. I will try and cover what I can, but primarily I will try and give you an idea of the context in which this work was composed and its achievements, both as a devotional text and as a work of literature. Some of what I'm going to tell you today, I'm sure many of you will already know, in which case, please bear with me because I'm just building up a case as I go along. Now, before I get on to Ramcharitmanas proper, I'm going to spend just a few brief moments talking about the Ramayana tradition. I'm sure everybody in this room is familiar with the Ramayana, so I don't need to say what it is. And I'm sure you also know that for the last 2,500 years, perhaps more. Poets, writers, folk performers, religious and social reformers, I mean, you name it, everybody, they have drawn upon the story of Ram as a source of inspiration. And the story has been told again and again and again in countless forms, in dozens of languages, not just in India, but further out, and making it one of the most popular and enduring stories in the world. In fact, I can't think of any other story that has been told so often and for so long. And Ram himself, more than any other hero of any saga, any epic, any poem, any even religious thought, Ram, more than anyone else, has been upheld as dharma personified. He's the epitome of righteousness, and his doings are the guide for right action. And in recent times, Ram's story has given us films, novels, the number of versions of the Ramayana that are currently being written, even in India, in various languages. And I'm sure, even though all of you, in fact, all you students here are much too young to have actually witnessed the phenomenon of Ramayana on TV. I'm sure you've all heard of the television series that was watched by more than 80 million viewers. So that's something. And that tells you about the power of the story of Ram. Now, the most influential, the oldest surviving literary telling of the story of Ram is, of course, that of Valmiki. And we tend to think of that as the original. Though, of course, the story was extant before Valmiki ever put it down. There were literary versions also. There was a Buddhist version, there was a Jain version already in existence at the time that Valmiki composed his Ramayana. But Valmiki's is considered to be the definitive version. And the influence of Valmiki's Ramayana has been so profound that the title of his epic, Ramayana, has come to denote the entire tradition of the story of Ram, from oral and folk performances to literary texts and translations. And within this Ramayana tradition, for instance, you will also find the Ramayana songs from Telangana, the folk performances of the Ram Leela in northern India, the Tamil Iramavataram by Kamban, and of course, the work we are going to discuss today, Tulsidas's Ramcharitmanas. Now, this is a question to the students from Dr. Kumar. I understand that you have studied this to some extent in your course. Is there anybody here who will volunteer to introduce the Ramcharitmanas to us? Anybody? Shivam is looking very thoughtful. I can't really see anybody else. Okay, never mind. So, Tulsidas began the composition of the Ramcharitmanas in 1574 CE. It consists of about 12,900 lines of Avadhi verse set in 7 kands or books, which makes it Tulsi's longest work. And this composition probably took him several years to do. He began it in Ayodhya and he finished it when he moved to Banaras. And all this information we get from the text itself. And in composing this, now, many people say, oh, he has retold the Ramayana. That is not exactly correct. He has not retold it. He has told the story of Ram in his own way. And this is his version. So it's not like he has retold Valmiki, though Valmiki is an important source. And he says so. Right at the start, he acknowledges Valmiki's influence and he salutes Valmiki as the author of the Ramayana and says that he is one of the most important sources for his own poem. But he is by no means retelling Valmiki. He also says that he first heard the story of Ram from his guru when he was still a boy in Sukarkhet. And the story that he heard from his guru is the story that he's now setting down, and he's setting it down in the spoken tongue. Now, talking again about Valmiki, in any discussion of anything to do with Ram's story, whether it is Ramcharitmanas or Kamban's Ramayana or anything, we always invariably end again, we begin and end with Valmiki. Now, Tulsi's epic differs from Valmiki's in one very, very important particular. Valmiki's Ramayana was not a religious text in the way we understand it. Yes, there are religious overtones in it, but it was not really a religious text. But Tulsi's Ramcharitmanas is, without question, a devotional text, and it has been composed in the spirit of bhakti. So, what then is bhakti? Anybody wishes to enlighten me? What is bhakti? What is your understanding of bhakti? Anyone? Okay. So now, those who have studied all these Ramayans, the scholars of the Ramayana tradition, they hold the view that Ram was originally a human hero. Maybe he was a real king somewhere, we don't know, we don't have the historical, the archaeological evidence, but it seems from all the things that we read and hear in the ancient tales that he was probably a human hero. And only later was he raised to the status of the avatar of Vishnu. It is felt that in the 5 central books of Valmiki's Ramayana also has 7 books, just like Tulsi's, Ram is portrayed as an earthly prince in books 2 to 6. It is in books 1 and 7 that his divinity appears. And many people feel, now this is controversial, but many scholars feel that the first and the last books were later additions to Valmiki's poem. And they feel, and it is only in those later poems that Ram is explicitly declared to be an incarnation of Vishnu upon earth. So Valmiki's Ramayana, currently accepted date for it being written is sometime during the first millennium BCE. Now, soon after the beginning of the Common Era, Ram began to be increasingly regarded as an avatar of Vishnu. And about the same time that all this was happening, a new attitude began to arose towards the worship of the divine, towards the relationship of mankind with the divine. And this new attitude, instead of meditation and yagyas and all kinds of other ritualistic practices, this new attitude was intense emotional attachment and love towards a chosen personal God and his avatars, particularly Vishnu and his earthly incarnations, Ram and Krishna. And this was bhakti. So instead of, you have hundreds of gods, you perform yagyas and you do this and you do that. No, the new worship became towards one chosen God. And the most popular one was Vishnu. And of Vishnu, his 2 incarnations, Ram and Krishna. And the other thing that bhakti did, it was public worship of that God and joyous worship. It was not serious. It was not austere. People did not sit in, silent meditation and dhyan. No, they sang, they danced. It was an outpouring of love and joy, and it was intense towards one person. And many times as bhakti has been compared to the love between lovers, where the worshipper is always the woman, the God is the man. So Kant Bhakti was another version of this. So this is what began to arise. Now Bhakti assumed a dualistic relationship between the devotee and his God. That devotee is one, his God is another. Whereas Advait, the non-dualistic school of philosophy, said we are all one and we become part of the one. So this was another difference in bhakti. Now the people who practiced bhakti, they believed that bhakti marg, the path of bhakti, was superior to the other means of achieving salvation, such as knowledge or good works or ascetic disciplining of the body. That was not it. It was just this intense devotion to God, to their chosen God. This was the way to attain salvation. And given the nature of this, bhakti was open to everybody. Not everybody can do austere meditation. Not everybody can fast. Not everybody can become an ascetic or give up everything. But everyone can engage in joyous worship of their chosen God. So bhakti was open to everyone. And it was open to everyone regardless of caste, class, or gender. Everyone could do it. Now, so this made it a big movement because, people got very excited about this, that they felt inclusive. Suddenly, salvation was something that was achievable for everyone. The other thing Bhakti did, it was characterized by its emphasis on the use of the spoken languages, making its teachings directly accessible to the common people, regardless of class or caste. Earlier, the traditional way had been everything that was important was written in Sanskrit. Not everybody knew Sanskrit. Very, very few people did. Sanskrit was regarded as a sacred language and it was used for all important literary and religious texts. So it was not easily accessible to everybody. Whereas something like the Ramcharitmanas or Kamban's Ramayana, everyone could understand because it was written in their spoken tongue. And with the advent of bhakti, Ram's transition from a human prince who had godlike characteristics to God, to actually God, that transformation became complete. And this was really critical in this whole Ram story tradition. And it is within this bhakti tradition, this transformation of Ram from a human hero to a divine, to his divinity, that is bhakti, and it is within these norms that Tulsi wrote his Ramcharitmanas. So when we look at the Ramcharitmanas, we have to keep bhakti in mind. We have to keep in mind that for Tulsi, Ram was unequivocally divine. Not so for Valmiki. Valmiki's Ram was human. He had human characteristics, much more than Tulsi's. Valmiki's Ramayana was questioned. Sita questioned him. Bharat questioned him. Lakshman questioned him. Tulsi's Ram, nobody questions him. Nobody, because he is God and he is divine. And as God, he knows everything. Everything is predetermined and everything he does has a reason. This you will not find in Valmiki. So this was a very big shift. Now, Tulsi has drawn on many, many sources in writing his Ramcharitmanas, or rather, I should say, he has been influenced by many sources in the composition of this work. His telling, his story, his Ramcharitmanas is closest to a Sanskrit text known as the Adhyatma Ramayana or the spiritual Ramayana. Now, this was composed sometime in between 1450 and 1550. Date's not very certain. And the Adhyatma Ramayana, it identifies Ram not only as an incarnation of Vishnu, but, and this is really important, also as the personification of Brahm, the ultimate absolute of the Upanishads and the Advaita school of philosophy. So now we have two ideas here. One is Bhakti, where Ram is the incarnation of Vishnu. The other is again the Advaita monism. That he is the ultimate absolute. So now Tulsi's Ram is exactly the same. He is the avatar of Vishnu, but he also has attributes of the Supreme God. He is all-knowing, all-seeing, and whatever he does in his incarnate form is therefore only his Leela. Now, is this clear? Because this is important, right? So we have two things here. One, Ram as the avatar of Vishnu, and one, Ram as the absolute God. As the absolute God, he knows everything. He's all-seeing, all-knowing, all-present. And As the avatar of Vishnu, therefore, as Ram on earth, what he does is only his Leela. It is not the inconsistencies of a human hero. If he goes and kills Bali, it is not somebody being politically savvy or anything. There is a divine purpose to it. If he goes and kills Ravan, it is not only because, his wife has been abducted. In fact, if his wife has been abducted, it is not because of Surpanakha or what have you, but there is this whole divine purpose behind every action that takes place. And this is an important thing to remember when you read Tulsidas. So many questions that we have, so many reactions that we have saying, oh, this is not right. Oh, how can he say that? These are explained by this stance of Tulsidas. And it is when you read a text like this, it is always important to remember the intent of the writer. And Tulsi's intent was bhakti very much, and also the amalgamation of Ram as the supreme God. Now, for instance, let us look at the way he treats Sita and the Agni Pariksha. What happens there? In Valmiki, she has to have this Agni Pariksha when she is rescued. All the gods come, Dashrath comes in spirit, they all condemn Ram for it, and they say that's not good. We question Ram for it, that how could he do this? In Valmiki, Sita undergoes a second Agni Pariksha later on, after Lava and Kusha born. We find that is completely unacceptable. What does Tulsi do? He says, now what happens with Bhakti and what happens with Tulsi? Ram is now divine. If Ram is divine, then so is Sita. So Sita is no longer just a princess. Now she is Shri, and Shri's representation on earth. And therefore, she as a divine goddess, she cannot be touched by Ravan, and she cannot be defiled by his touch. So what happens? Tulsi uses the device of the Chaya Sita, the illusory Sita, where Sita enters fire, the real Sita. She stays there with Agni till all this other stuff plays out. And then, as a means to get the real Sita back, Ram does this Agni Pariksha. And it is done completely with Sita's knowledge and consent. And this is why it's being done. So, you no longer question Ram on this. That's gone. And then the Uttarkand of Valmiki, where Sita is banished to the forest and all that stuff happens. Now Tulsi doesn't need it. Tulsi mentions it. Interestingly, he mentions it. He says that, even though that Ram loved the people of Ayodhya very much, because even though they maligned Sita, he still looked after them. There are lines to that effect in the poem. But he doesn't need to write Valmiki's Uttarkand, because Sita, the real Sita, has actually never been defiled by Ravan. So there's no question of banishing her. So he doesn't need that. And that is, again, it is all stemming from bhakti. And the fact that Ram is not only an incarnation of Vishnu, he is the supreme God, and Shri is his primal energy, his Shakti. She is Sita is Shri. Okay. Now, so Valmiki Ramayana, Adhyatma Ramayana, and also a lot of other influences were at play on Tulsi. And he actually pays homage to all of them, and he acknowledges their contribution to his story in the Balkand, in the beginnings stanzas of the Balkand. So, for instance, when he writes about the child Ram, where this bhajan, Thumaka Chalat Ramchandra and all that they have the origin of these things, that is clearly possibly influenced by the Bhagavad Puran, where there are and contemporary bhakti poetry in praise of Krishna, where Bal Krishna is such a charming and delightful motif in that poetry. There's not really that much written about the child Ram as there is about the child Krishna, and clearly that Krishna poetry has influenced Tulsi in his writing about the childhood of Ram. Now then, I don't know if you have read this or remember this, but Tulsi's description of Sita's first meeting with Ram, it is one of my favorite passages in the Ramcharitmanas, in Balkand. And this is in a garden where Ram has gone with Lakshman to pick flowers for his morning puja. And Sita has gone with her handmaidens to offer worship at the temple of Parvati. And they catch sight of each other. And the description is just beautiful. We don't have time, otherwise I would have read it to you. So this was possibly inspired by Prasanna Raghav. It's a 14th century drama by Jayadev. So there are many such sources. So if you look at what Tulsi has done, he's drawn upon all these sources. He's a bhakt. He writes from the standpoint of bhakti. But Tulsi was, what can I say? One was his devotion, but he was also a very intellectual man. If you read the Ramcharitmanas, you will be left in no doubt as to the intellectual, cerebral capacity of this poet. And he was also very aware of what was happening around him and of all the various ideologies at play. And what does he do? In the Ramcharitmanas, he brings together these contrasting ideologies of his time. And what are these? One is this joyous, unrestrained bhakti of Ram, of Vishnu's incarnations. The other is this austere Advait meditation. The worship of Vishnu, the worship of Shiv, the worship of Nirgun, the worship of Sagun. All of this he melds together. So Tulsi is Ram, he's the supreme being personified, Sita is his Shakti. From Ram and Sita come all the other gods, including Shiv and Parvati, whom Tulsi otherwise calls the father and mother of the universe. And even, and this can mess with one's mind, even Lakshmi and Vishnu spring from Ram and Sita. Though Ram is also an incarnation of Vishnu. So he's melding it all together. For Tulsi, Ram is the supreme God. Yet, throughout the poem, Ram says that without the worship of Shiv, no one can attain to his bhakti. So, so Ram is saying, no, Shiv's important too. But Shiv is saying that Ram is important because without chanting Ram's mantra, no one can attain salvation in Banaras, which is Shiv's city. So, and then what does Tulsi do? He takes every opportunity to describe the beauty of Ram, his incarnate form, his Sagun form, in detail. His body is dark as a rain-laden cloud. His face is radiant. He has lotus eyes. The tilak on his forehead is glowing. But in the very next phrase, he reminds us that he is the all-pervading spirit of the universe, unborn, uncreated, without flaw, without form. So Sagun and Nirgun come together. Shiv and Vishnu come together. The Bhakti and Advait worship come together. And this is one of the significant achievements of Tulsidas in the Ramcharitmanas. Now, Tulsidas, of course, wrote it in Awadhi, and that had repercussions on his poem. Just give me a second. I have to keep track of the times so that I don't overrun. Right. So, yes. So now his poem was written in Awadhi, not in the sacred language Sanskrit. And that had repercussions. The religious establishment of the times did not approve of that. Tulsi, there is an incident which is often spoken of, that once when he was trying to enter Banaras, he was almost lynched by the Brahmins of the city because they felt this was blasphemous to tell the story of Ram in the spoken tongue. And that's a bit ironic, isn't it? Because today we look upon Tulsi's Ramcharitmanas as establishment. But it's interesting to remember that when he wrote it, he was considered the outlier. He was the one who did not conform. But despite the disapproval by the Brahmins, or maybe because of it, and also, of course, because it was so accessible to everybody, the Ramcharitmanas became very, very popular amongst other groups, especially the merchant caste and the lower sections of society, the lower orders of society. And very soon, and this is again something really unique, it acquired the status and religious authority usually enjoyed only by Sanskrit texts. And within a very short time, it was carried by sadhus, by traveling musicians, by merchants. The story just spread all across northern India, from Tulsi's Banaras, where he completed it, to in the east to the Rajput kingdoms of Rajasthan in the west. Now, it is worth remembering that this spread of the Ramcharitmanas took place in an era before printing and before much literacy. Too many people didn't know how to read and write. So it was all carried by word of mouth. It was memorized and it was repeated. And that is how it spread. And such was the spread and influence of Tulsi's poem that Nabhadas, who was his contemporary, he said that Tulsi was Valmiki himself, born again to bring his epic once more to the world. And this you will find in Bhaktamal, written about 1585 or so. Ramcharitmanas continued to be popular. And in the late 18th century, it found royal patronage in the court of resurgent Hindu kingdoms in northern India. They found it a convenient text, an authoritative text, and an accessible text through which to assert their Hindu identity. And in the 19th century, the Ramcharitmanas gained even greater currency in northern India because mainstream Hinduism found within it an answer to the Christian Bible and a nationalistic response to British colonialism. Okay, it became a tool of identity and a way to oppose the British. Then came printing, the development of movable type in Indian scripts. It led to a growth of vernacular presses and printing of popular books in Indian languages. Till in 1810 in Calcutta was printed Tulsidas's Ramcharitmanas. And by the end of the century, by the end of the 19th century, printed versions of Tulsi's epic were available all across the north of India, from Calcutta in Bengali translation to Gurmukhi script editions in Delhi and Lahore, Gujarati and Marathi versions in Bombay. It was everywhere. And today, as all of you know, Tulsi's poem is read, sung, recited, retold in almost every Hindu household in northern India. And this is the accepted and dominant version of the story of Ram. It is also the basis of the Ram Leela, a tradition that is believed to have been started in Banaras by Tulsidas himself, and which is, as you know, still going strong. Now we meet a lot of criticism. We hear a lot of criticism about Tulsidas. And he's been criticized for his support of the caste system, for his reverence for Brahmins, his characterization of women as inherently inferior to men. And all these criticisms have evidence, and they are valid too. They're not invalid criticisms. But there are two things here. One, I feel we have to remember the time and the era and the purpose for which this text was written. Always remember the intent of the writer. And secondly, read it with a little more detail, because we see that throughout his text, Tulsi brings together opposing views. So, for instance, while paying homage to the Brahmins as gods on earth, he upholds Shabari, the tribal woman, and who waited for Ram in the forest. He upholds her as the epitome of devotion and virtue. So the thing is that for Tulsi, while the social order must be upheld, that's important. He is not a social activist. He's not saying break down caste, do this, do that. No, the social order must be upheld. But within that is bhakti. And within bhakti, the boundaries of caste, of class, of gender disappear. So you have the structure of society. Tulsi is not breaking that. Tulsi is talking about bhakti. If you're a bhakt, if you're within bhakti, then none of this matters. So slightly nuanced thing, which again, we have to get our heads around. So, and then of course, the Ram Leela, which can be seen as an attempt at a degree of social integration, even though it was within the Hindu framework, because everybody, irrespective of caste, class, or religion, was invited to take part in the Ram Leela. And I like to think that this inclusivity still remains, by and large, in India today in the performance of the Ram Leela. May I ask, how much time do we have left? Dr. Kumar, are you there? Hello? It's a 3:45 in India, am I right? Hello?
Yes, madam.
Yes, ma'am,
I'm
you are
very
right.
much here. Yes.
Yes, can you just tell me how much time I have left for this?
I think
Another
1 minute.
15 minutes?
Yeah, another 15 minutes. Yes.
Okay.
You can go.
So then I will move on to something a little different. We're talking about, I'm not going to spend time on the life of Tulsi or even the structure of the Ramcharitmanas, which I'm sure all of you know and which is easy to find. I want to talk to you about two characters that appear in the Ramayana and they appear in Tulsi Das's Ramcharitmanas. One is Surpanakha. The other is Swayamprabha. So Surpanakha, everybody knows, right? She is Ravan's sister. What does her name mean? Does anybody know the meaning of Surpanakha's name? No, it means having fingernails like winnowing fans. Not a very flattering name. Okay, so we all know what happens with Surpanakha. She shows up in the forest and there's Ram and Lakshman and she sees Ram's beauty and she falls in love with him. And Tulsi says that she takes on the appearance of a beautiful woman and she approaches him. And then there is this back and forth between the brothers and when she takes on her real form of a Rakshasi and threatens Sita, Lakshman cuts off her nose and ears, right? Valmiki's Surpanakha is slightly different. She doesn't take on the form of a beautiful woman. She comes to them in her own form of this ugly, pot-bellied Rakshasi. And she sees Ram and she falls for him and she says, "Who are you?" And Ram very politely explains to her who he is, tells her his whole story. And then she says, "Why don't you and I get together? Because I have never seen a man like you. And you are the only one I think is equal to me." And Ram kind of sees her. He can see how horrible looking she is. And he's kind of grins to himself. And then he directs her to Lakshman, who's also amused. And he directs her back. So, and then finally, and Surpanakha is taking all this in good faith. She doesn't realize she's being teased. So she's getting more and more worked up. And then finally she loses it. And, well, I don't even think she loses it so much in Valmiki. She gets convinced by the brothers that they like her. And she says, she tells Ram that it's this human female who's in the way. So I'll just eat her up and then you and I can be together. And then, of course, Ram loses his temper and then Lakshman cuts off her ears and nose. So with Valmiki, you can develop a kind of sneaking sympathy for Surpanakha. But for Tulsi, in Tulsi, it's less because, she first appears as a beautiful woman and then she changes her form. So there's a little bit of subterfuge there. The other woman is Swayamprabha. Swayamprabha, Tulsi does not mention her by name, but Valmiki does. Swayamprabha appears in Kishkinda Kand, when the monkeys set out to look for Sita. And they reach, they're searching for her and they are very thirsty. There is no water. They can't find water and they say, without water, we'll all die. So Hanuman climbs a mountain peak and he looks around for water and he sees this strange cave or cavern. And he sees that all kinds of birds are either flying over it or going into it. So the monkeys go in there and they see a beautiful garden, a lake, and in a temple there, a woman sitting there in tapasya mode. She is an ascetic. And she is Swayamprabha, and her name, Swayamprabha, self-luminous, who she is lit from within because of her ascetic practices. And she helps them, and everything is okay. And then she goes off to Ram, and he grants her salvation. So look at these two women, how they have been handled. Surpnakha and Swayamprabha are the only two unmarried women in the Ramayana. Every other woman is married. But Surpnakha, who is aggressive, she is individualistic, she wants to do her own thing, she breaks the bounds, the social norms, she is punished. Swayamprabha, who is also individualistic, but does what she wants within social boundaries, she is glorified. Think about these two. I'm not going to give conclusions, but I would like to leave you with this thought that these are two women who are represented in these two different ways by both Valmiki and Tulsidas. What could it mean? What does it mean? How do you feel about it? That's where I will leave you with it. And if anybody has any questions, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rohini ji. This lecture was very wonderful, and you proved that shlok which Ram says to Lakshman in Lanka Kand. Iyam swarnamayi Lanka name Lakshmana rochite janani janmu bhumishya swargata bigariyasi. We are in India, we are staying in India, but we don't know too much about the literary tradition related to Ram. But obviously you shifted to London in 1997, but your heart or emotion did not live Indian literature or Indian tradition. Therefore I said, Iyam swarnamayi Lanka name Lakshmana rochite janani janmu bhumishya swargatapi gariyasi. So now I would like to invite questions, and I request you people to present your question in brief. So now floor is open.
Is it okay if I ask a question? Am I audible?
Yes.
All right, thanks. Thank you, Rohini ji. That was absolutely wonderful for us teachers and for the students as well. I had a couple of questions. One, what are the other major influential texts which have the Mayavi Sita, Chaya Sita? And do we have a kind of explicit genealogy from those previous texts to what Tulsidas does in Ramcharitmanas? The second is, it's a speculative question, and like all speculative questions, I'm sure there is no definitive answer. But in your reading and translation and research, have you noticed any direct or oblique relationship between the Sufi Premakhyans, which in a way really made Awadhi the literary language that it was before Tulsi's Ramcharitmanas, and the allegorical conflation of human devotion and divine love. So whether it is, since in this paper we have Manjan's Madhumalati as well, and for reasons that should be obvious, we could not include Jayasi's Padmavati. But is there, because I was watching this lecture by Professor Ludgendorff on YouTube, and he raises this very tentative possibility that in a way Tulsidas was also in conversation with the Muslim Sufi writers. And the third one again is slightly more controversial, and I ask it in a pure spirit of curiosity. Are there references in Tulsidas's voluminous writings, not just the Ramcharitmanas, about the Ram Janmabhoomi or any temple that might have been destroyed, given that it supposedly happened some years before the composition of the Ramcharitmanas? Thank you.
Thank you. So let me answer the last question first because it has the shortest answer. No, I could not see any evidence at all.
Thank you.
Nothing that says, okay, this is the spot where he was born. This is where there is a temple or should be a temple. There is no such reference at all. So, I mean, he does talk about Ayodhya as being the birthplace of Ram, but that's all. He doesn't give any definitive proof, nothing more than what is there in tradition.
Right.
And definitely no, he does not mention any spot, any place. So that's simply answered. Your other questions are a little more complicated. If you bear with me a second, I will just pull out the references to the Chaya Sita. Just a second. Sorry, it's just that my computer, I have it on another machine and it's just taking a little bit of time to reach that, find that particular text. So Adhyatma Ramayana, I think, also had it. And this Chaya Sita, yes, here we go. The idea of this Chaya Sita was arose as early as the 8th century CE. So well before Tulsidas's time, this idea was there. And then the text which developed it was again the Adhyatma Ramayana. So, and then Tulsi, of course, it transferred to Ramcharitmanas. I don't have with me the entire genealogy of Chaya Sita right now, but I could look it up and I could email it to you if you are interested.
That would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, but it did arise as early as the 8th century CE because Bhakti, as you know, had started much before. You know, with Tulsi, it was a kind of a culmination.
Sure.
So in terms of the Sufi text, you know, Mrigavati and all these others, I have always felt that there is a connection. Now, it is speculative when I talk about it because I have not made a scholarly study of the Sufi texts. That's on my list. That's the next thing I'm going to look at, but I haven't yet. But whatever I do know about Sufism, whatever I do know about their approach to the divine, it is the same as Bhakti. It is also intense personal devotion to their chosen God. It is also joyous celebration of that God. And I would tend to agree with Professor Ludgendorff that Tulsi was possibly in conversation with them. Tulsi does not strike me as a man who lived in a bubble. I think he was very much in touch with what was going on, and Sufism was definitely one of those things. And in this context is one interesting fact about Ramcharitmanas, which normally is not highlighted. It is the use of Persian and Arabic words in the Manas. You know, we all say it is Avadhi, but actually Padmavat is written in purer Avadhi than the Manas is. Padmavat is Thet Avadhi, even though it has been written in the Urdu script. And Tulsi, though it was written in the Devanagari script, he does have Persian and Arabic words. So I'm sure there were influences. I'm sure there was dialogue and interconnection. But yes, it's speculative. I really haven't come across anything definitive.
If you allow, may I add something?
Yes, please.
Chaya Sita is visible in Valmiki Ramayana, as far as I know, and even in Vishnu Puran. And basically, in Vishnu Puran, once Ravan was going somewhere and he saw that one woman, Vetravati, she was enchanting Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya, Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Yes. So Ravan was hypnotized with her beauty and he tried to seduce Vetravati. So Vetravati cursed Ravan that uh, after long time she will become the cause of his destruction,
Is that
and he burned herself into ashes. Yes. And about Arabian Persian, in Jaipur Literary Festival, Harish Trivedi, Ashok Vajpayee, and Philip Lutgendorf, they were discussing Ramcharitmanas. There I came to know that there are 1000 Arabic words in Ramcharitmanas. Like, for instance, Bahori Gai Garib Niwaju. Then Sahib, word Sahib. So, and there are many. Obviously, it is very tough to count 1000 words from Arabic. So, I agree that Awadhi, Malik Muhammad Jais's Padmawas is in pure Awadhi compared to the Ramcharitmanas of Tulsidas. And Ramcharitmanas, you will see all the 7 cantos begin with Mangalacharan, and all Mangalacharan are in Sanskrit. And we can see some put of Bhojpuri also.
If I may just carry on that aspect of linguistic diversity,
Yes,
as
yes.
a translator, Rohini ji, could you speak to the students a bit more about the specific strategies or choices that you made? Because very soon you would be talking about translating the Katha Sarit Sagar as well. So translating Avadhi into English, Sanskrit, Prakrit into English, how do you, as a person wearing these multiple hats, make specific choices about the vocabulary or the register?
Right. This is it is a struggle, I have to confess, because the very nature of these languages is different. Say Sanskrit, for instance, it's a very concise language. English is not. So what you will say in half a line in Sanskrit will take 1.5 lines in English. That's an issue. One thing that one has to deal with. And it's similar for Awadhi, similar for Hindi also, actually, in many ways. And particularly in translating something like Tulsi Das, where you listen to the manas being recited or sung, whether you understand it or not, the musicality of the composition blows you away. The lyricality of the words, the sounds that he's put together, it's amazing. It is impossible to reproduce that in English. It cannot be done. So I did not even try. I was fully aware that if I try to do that, I'm going to make a complete mess of it. There has been one attempt to translate Tulsidas in poetry, in rhyming meter, trying to keep, and it reads terribly. So that's not something. So one of the choices I made was that I'm not even going to try to reproduce that kind of musicality, because I feel, one, the English language doesn't lend itself to it, and two, my abilities as a poet, no, they are limited. So I worked within my own abilities, and I worked to give as much of the meaning and of the sense of Tulsi as I could, without struggling with meters and stuff. So that's why I chose free verse rather than anything else. In terms of the language, Tulsi has some very, very clever word plays, which unfortunately in English you miss out. I've tried to put those in, explain some of those, not all, through footnotes and notes to explain stuff, but it's not always possible. So there is that particular loss in translating. The Katha Sarit Sagar was much easier. And we'll take that up in detail later, but that's not such a nuanced text. It's not so complicated. So that's a matter of, there were different challenges there in making that text more accessible, because it's a very complicated text.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, I have asked, let us discuss from the perspective of female also. There are three
Oh my
chopais which I will say, and we can see, we should try to analyze Tulsidas within through all these three chopai. First, he says, I know it is very popular and many people criticize Tulsi for that. ढोल गंवार शूद्र पशु नारी ये सब सकल ताड़ना के अधिकारी. Okay, he says, but at one place in Balkand, he also mentions कति विधि सृजी नारी जगमाही पराधीन सपने हो सुख नाही. When Maina, the mother of Parvati, is explaining what to do and how to behave with Lord Shiva, because Shiva is her husband. And other thing, when Ansuya in Aranyakand, Ansuya preaches Sita, during that time she says, धीरज धर्म मित्र अरुनारी आपदी काल परिखई हैं चारी. So these are three chopais related to women as far as I know. So how we will analyze the view of Tulsi, and we should talk about Ahilya also. And people believe that Ahilya and Tara, they belong to Panchkanya. They were in the category of Panchkanya, and Ahilya and Tara and even Mandodari. These three characters are belong to same epic. Either it is Valmiki Ramayana or it is Ramcharitmanas. So please, I request you to focus on that. And if you have some time, please talk about what is Doha, Chaupai, and also. So if I would be very grateful if you will do this.
Do we have time to talk about what
Yes,
what
I
the
think
various meters?
it is 4 o'clock. So we can take, we have half an hour or 20 minutes. So
Okay, but I saw quite a few hands up as
okay,
well.
then yeah, I think I have spoken more than it's required. So let us take other questions. Yes. So yeah.
Dear ma'am, my question is.
May I know who's speaking? I can't.
Ma'am, this is Shivam speaking.
Okay.
Yeah. So, ma'am, we have a very recent hand of yours, a very recent Indian hand on translation of Ramcharitmanas. But could you please suggest some Indian translator on Ramayana, Valmiki's Ramayana, apart from
Valmiki
Gita,
Ramayana. That's a difficult question, because I have been, when I have been looking for a good translation of Valmiki's Ramayana, the best I have found is not an Indian translation. This is the one I have found. Hang on. Tell you what it is.
Ma'am, is it Robert P. Goldman?
Yes, that's right. It's those. I found that really good. Pollock and Goldman. I think Sheldon Pollock was the series translator.
Yes, ma'am, there are many translators. And my next question is to Dr. Kumar. He talked about 10 translations of Ramcharitmanas. So these 10 translations are translations into English or into different languages?
All 10 translation I have talked from Awadhi into English. For instance, R.C. Prasad, Atkins, Ashok Mehta, Philip Lujgetdorf, and obviously Rohini Chowdhury ji. They are good translation, and apart from that, we have we have other translator also, but it is not. We don't have much time to discuss everything.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you, ma'am.
Sorry, Saikat. Yeah. So if we are reading the Ramcharitmanas as a cultural text, I'm curious about the fact that there was a sort of preceding tradition of Ram Bhakti, but in the Nirgun Parampara of Kabir, in the Nirgun Parampara, Kabir, Dudayal. And in fact, in the region of Malwa, you find a fairly popular kind of tradition of Ram Bhajans based on Kabir's entire Nirgun framework. Sakal Hans Mein Ram Viraje and all. Now, compared to that, when the Ramcharitmanas appeared, it was a kind of a comparable kind of an attempt to again popularize Ram Bhakti in a slightly different way. Why is it that we see that the Ramcharitmanas has had a far more enduring and a far more widespread impact as far as the populace and the cultural imagination of United Provinces and Central India is concerned, compared to the Nirgun Parampara in which Kabir and Dadu Dayal tried to sort of?
Well, I think that's a really good question and something I have wondered about. But I personally feel that for most people, Sagun is easier to comprehend than Nirgun. Nirgun is abstract. Okay, Sagun is in front of you. It is a form. There are attributes, there are qualities. You can look at how beautiful his body is. You can look at what he does. You can talk about his deeds. You can draw parallels to your own life. It is easier to identify, easier to emulate. Nirgun you can't see it. It's one sense less to understand. So it is the mind which then has to, and you can't even really imagine because he has no form. Nirgun has no form. Nirgun has no attributes. Nirgun has no qualities. Nirgun is just there. So what I have seen and what I feel is that one usually, the way the human brain works, it's always easier if you can see something, hear something, touch something, versus something totally abstract. And that's true in every field of learning or experience. And it is only from Sagun that you ultimately reach Nirgun for most people. Of course, there are those who don't need the crutches of Sagun. So Sagun is easier. Sagun is, it's also more emotional. You can fall in love with the form, for instance. And that was the whole charm of this Sagun Bhakti. And you see that all around you. Most people get attracted by Sagun. That I feel was one important part. The other one was this amalgamation of different ideologies that Tulsi did. There was something in it for everyone. He didn't offend the Shiv Bhakts, the Shiv Parampara. He did not offend the Vaishnav. He brought them together. He talked about Advait. He talked about dualism. He talked about everything. Ram could be all. So he wasn't just one. I think that also helped. And then the vehicle of the story of Ram. You have a story that is so incredibly powerful. Forget about your religious affiliation. Forget about all devotion. Just read the story as a story. It's engrossing. You want to know what happens next. And the best part of this story is that even though you have heard it from, ever since you can remember, you can't remember a time in your life when you didn't know the story of Ram. You can always discuss it again. You can always read it again, and you will find something new to talk about, to discuss, to argue about, to think about. So I think all this helped in making this so much more popular, so much more accessible to people. Of course, that's my personal view, based on any statistics that I have.
Thank you. Namita, please.
Thank you, Rohini ji, for putting it in such a wonderful philosophical, linguistic, and historical, giving us that perspective. My question relates to something that Mr. Akhilesh Kumar also asked, and I'm interested in the Ahilya episode, and especially Tulsidas ji's kind of depiction of it, because when we look at the Valmiki Ramayana, it receives a lot of attention, her transgression and everything. Whereas I think it is to an extent maybe glossed over. We are not told exactly the nature of her indiscretion. And we just the word apavani, something like that is used. And it's just, the emphasis seems to be on Ahilya's bhakti for Ram. Would you care to share your perspective about this?
Well, I think
Thank you.
answered that yourself, that the emphasis on Ahilya's bhakti for Ram, because Tulsi's whole objective was bhakti. He was writing from the bhakti perspective. Also remember that Tulsi was writing for an audience that was very familiar with these stories. He didn't feel the need to go into detail, and not just Ahilya. There are so many stories that he just mentions. He does not go into detail. There's a passing reference to something which actually occupies a lot of space in Valmiki or somewhere else or in some other Ramayana. Tulsi doesn't bother. He uses his time and space to talk about the things which he wanted to highlight, which is fundamentally his whole bhakti point of view. So I think that's why, he deemed Ahilya important enough to be there simply because of her Rama. That was the most important aspect of Ahilya for him, not her transgressions.
Yeah, thank you. That answers. And in light of what you said, I'm thinking of the Wali birth episode also.
Yes.
Because Tulsidas just say usme kuch katu shabd kahe, whereas Valmiki gives us a whole list of Wali's problems with Ram.
The whole conversation he has.
Yes, edited out in a way.
Yes.
Thank you.
And in Tulsidas, you don't really question Bali Vad so much because, everything is happening because the Lord wants it so. And everyone's getting salvation, and it's actually a benefit to die at the hands of the Lord. So the whole perspective is coming from a different direction.
Ruchika, finally, thank you.
Hi, ma'am. So I also want to talk about the ideology of Tulsi. So I want to refer to Pollock's entire argument in his article, Political Imagination, Ramayana and Political Imagination, and how he writes that in the second millennium onwards, Ramayana did have a huge impact, and that was because of the coming of Turks, and they did grow a certain binarization within the Ramayana tradition. And it did impact Ramayans of the times, and it definitely Tulsidas's Ramayana was very effective in how the Ramleelas also got shaped up, and ultimately the burning of Ravan's effigies, seeing Ravan as demonization, like the demonization of the other, which Pollock talks about. So I was wondering if you could comment on that. Like, I do agree that Ravan achieving salvation at the hands of the Lord is an impact of the Bhakti tradition, but then this political imagination of his times, does it also impact Tulsi's ideology?
Now that's a very deep question you have asked me, Ruchika, which I have to confess that I have not actually given it much thought. But I would say that, again, what I know of Tulsi from his writings, from the way he talks about the world, Tulsi has to have been cued into what was going on around him. And I'm sure it affected him. One of the things that I have always found interesting in Tulsi is that if you just read the Manas, of course, he is talking about a particular story and a particular tradition, and his whole focus is on the Ram story. But somehow, while there is a lot of comment on contemporary Hindu society, he's talking about Brahmins, he's talking about this, that, and the other. He's talking about, and through the Ramcharitmanas, you can get a very good sense of the social norms, the social Hindu norms of the period. He seems to be writing in a world where, the political turmoil is not happening. Yes, there are stories later on that he went to Akbar's court and this happened, that happened, but within the Manas itself, I don't see it. And that is something which I have always been intrigued by. But I'm sure there was an impact on him, and I'm sure there was an impact the other way also. But my study has not been in that direction. So I would hesitate to comment on it with any authority.
Thank you, ma'am.
Whereas, if you read Banarsi Das, for instance, now there's a lot of comment, political comment, economic comment, social comment on the world. And I think his is an accurate portraiture of what was actually happening there between communities, merchants, this, that, and the other. It's just a whole completely different way of looking at things, I think.
Thank you. Thank you. Sanya, please go ahead.
First of all, thank you, ma'am, for an extremely insightful session. So my question is basically about the portrayal of Sita in Tulsidasa's Ramcharitramanas. So, ma'am, as like what the inferences which we can draw from the lecture and what you told, that Tulsidas considered Sita as Shri. Again, like by labeling her as a divine entity, he does not feel the need or the urge to put light on the life of Sita in the Uttarkand, as we see in what Valmiki does. But ma'am, again, that brings us to this question of discrediting somewhat Sita's role as a divine entity and putting the entire onus on Ram's divinity. And as we can see this idea of the entire pantheon, which we see, the Shiva tradition, the Shakti tradition, all these assimilating in this one figure of Lord Ram. So in this way, maybe we are getting a very myopic view of the other sects, and only the focus is on Ram. But Sita is an equally important part of it, being the deity there. So my question is about how he discredits that important portion by not putting light on Sita's character in that.
See, again, I'm not sure whether discredit is the right word here. Okay, because once again, let's go right back to the intent of the poet. Where is he coming from? And what is it that he is trying to do? For him, Ram is the supreme God. There are no two ways about it. Yes, he wants to bring in Shiv as well. He wants to bring in Advait as well. All of that. But at the end of the day, Tulsi's chosen God is Ram. And Tulsi's bhakti is for Ram. And everything and everyone is secondary to Ram. Okay. And Sita, see, Tulsi, as I said earlier, he is not into highlighting or battling social ills. He's quite happy with the way the social order is. He's not really commenting on that. He's not really fighting it. He is working within it. Okay. And Sita is Shri. She's Ram's energy. She's his extension of Ram. All that is there. And Sita and Ram are therefore, they are destined to be together because they are who they are. And that's how Tulsi works. So I don't think he is out to discredit Sita or to discredit anybody. He is very clear. Ram is the supreme God. That's all that matters to him. And that's where he's coming from. Valmiki is not doing that. Valmiki is not saying Ram is his supreme God. Valmiki is not saying Ram is his chosen God. Valmiki is telling a story. And Ram has elements of divinity. In Valmiki's Ramayana, there are instances where Ram forgets he's divine. He has to be reminded that, do you know who you are? You're Vishnu's avatar. Why are you behaving like this? They actually tell him that. In Uttarkand, Ram gets the telling off of his life from Brahma, from Lakshman, from Bharat, from Dashrath. Tulsi, you cannot imagine anyone will question what Ram does. In Valmiki Ramayana, Sita questions Ram. She questions him on relatively smaller decisions. For instance, when they go into the forest and the rishis come to him and they ask for protection, and Ram gives it to them, Sita questions him. She says, on what basis have you decided to protect them and war against the other inhabitants of the forest? Can you imagine Tulsi Sita doing that? She won't. And that is the whole point, that when we read these texts, we have to look at the intent. What is it that the poet was getting at? Where was he coming from? What's his whole agenda? Tulsi's agenda is Ram Bhakti. And you have to see it in that context. And that's why this feeling that, oh, he hasn't given Sita enough importance, he made everything less. Yes, he has, because Ram is supreme for him. Does that make sense?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am.
We will have to wind up within 5 minutes because next session will start at 5 o'clock. So now it is 4:25. So we can take one more question, not more than that. If anyone wants, ask the question, and this question would be last question.
I don't think there is anyone, Akhilesh, and I think it's safe to wind up this session now.
Yes. Because I did not know that. Okay. So now, Rohini ji, we are very.
Excuse me, Professor Kumar. There is one question here from Ruchika Jain on chat.
She's already asked it. She's already asked it.
She's already. Okay.
So, madam, I'm very thankful and grateful to you for lovely lecture and wonderful. This lecture was very amazing, and we got a lot of information. And it was not only informative, but it was a very critical, and we had good discussion to the larger extent. So, by saying all these things, now we will wind up this session and we will join sharp at 4:50 so that we can start the next session on Katha Sarit Sagar at 5 o'clock. So now from Awadh, we will go to Kashmir.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. This was very delightful to